Hello and welcome to Understanding Business Cycles in Macroeconomics. First slide, I don't think will surprise you too much. It shows you the nature of a business cycle. We're going to have peaks, we're going to have troughs, and our job really in this reading is to understand a couple of things. First of all, what a peak and what a recession look like, look at a few indicators which might suggest we're heading to recession, and then really look at these three things. Start to talk about GDP growth, measure inflation and employment, and obviously, crucially, unemployment. So hopefully in the long term, as we'll talk about in other areas of macroeconomics, we are looking for growth long term in real GDP. So hopefully it is on an upward trend. But during that time, as we say, there will be peaks and troughs. So let's get into it straight away and look at some of these indicators that we can try and find to see if we are indeed in a contractionary period or an expansionary period. And the first one we need to know about is the inventory to sales ratio. Kind of makes sense this. If you look at it step by step, it's fairly intuitive. So if we're early in a contraction, so we're just tipping over the edge, sales slow unexpectedly. The whole point of this inventory to sales ratio is that we don't react quick enough. So sales start to slow, nobody saw it coming, which means we get an unplanned increase in inventories. We've been buying inventories to try and meet our demand during the upswing. Suddenly we contract, nobody knew that was going to happen, and we're left with a build-up in inventory. What does that mean? Well, if sales are falling and inventory levels are building up, you will see an increase in these inventory to sales ratios. So in the exam, we have to identify an above normal level of the inventory to sales ratio. Could be an indication of a contraction. And the bottom half of the slide is the exact opposite. If we're early in an expansion, again, didn't see it coming, sales leap, and we didn't have the inventory ready to meet those sales. So inventory gets used up, sales start to go through the roof, and the inventory to sales ratio decreases. So knowing what the ratio is clearly key. And then as long as you remember it's inventory to sales and that firms don't anticipate either contractions or expansions, then you should be good to work out which direction the ratio is heading. Next up, labor and capital utilization. Exactly the same point on this slide, which I think makes it fairly straightforward to remember. It says once again, we're not reacting quickly enough. So firms are slow to hire or lay off employees or decrease physical capital because frequent adjustments are costly. You can't every single day anticipate where the economy might be going and start to bump up or down your labor or capital levels. So they try and wait as long as they can, which means, once again, if we're going into a contraction, we are slow to react. Sales are falling, but we are slow to adjust labor or capital, which means we have less intensive use. So you'll see a low utilization rate as we head into the contraction. And the opposite is true for an expansion. As we plunge down towards the recession, eventually reacted, laid off employees, decreased physical capital levels. So they're now pretty low. And as we start to hit an expansion and go upwards, well, we've hardly got any labor or any capital, but sales are going through the roof. They're going to be used pretty intensively. So your most efficient use of labor and capital is probably at the start of an expansion. So when trends persist, they will eventually adjust, but not in the short term. Okay, the housing sector is worth talking about. If you've read anything in the media over the last decade, then I think you're pretty much aware that the housing sector can be fairly key. Most interesting point for us when we're talking about a business cycle is that housing is highly cyclical. So you can use it to a certain extent as an indicator, but you have to be aware of all the different factors that are coming into play. And really the exam requires us to know each of these bullet points and be able to talk to the examiner about them. So first of all, I think fairly obviously mortgage rates are key. When rates go up, new housing starts and purchases of properties will fall. I don't think that takes much explanation. Income and housing costs, well, as income rises, you would expect, again, the property market to start to take off as people feel that wealth. But you've also got to look at the costs relative to the income, and it will also depend to a certain extent on mortgage rates. So if you have the perfect storm of high levels of income and low mortgage rates, that should cause the sector to take off. And then you get speculation. This is the problem that we saw back in 07, 08. When you get incomes rising, low rates, houses going up in price, people seeing an increase in wealth because their house keeps going up in value, people start to expect that to go on forever. And hence you get pretty much a bubble. And people buy in and buy in, buy in, and fuel the house price increase. Finally, demographics. Just make sure you know what we're talking about here. Household formations. We're talking about the number of people who are moving out of their family home and setting up a household on their own. Pretty difficult to measure, but what you can do is keep a measure of the demographics in your economy and look pretty much for the group between the ages of 25 and 40 who most typically will set up a household. And geographic shifts in population density, obviously where populations are moving to and wherever they are moving to, either country by country or from urban to rural or vice versa. That will dictate what's going to happen to prices of houses in those areas. So it is cyclical. It can be used to see what's happening to the business cycle, but be aware there is a whole slew of factors which affect the housing sector. Next up is the external trade sector. So we're looking here at our interaction with our neighbours. That's via imports and exports. Now be careful. This is a common mistake that people make. If we're looking at imports, the level of imports into our economy, key there is domestic income. So it's dependent on our business cycle. So just link in your mind imports to our domestic business cycle. However, our level of exports is all about our neighbours. So if you're looking at the level of exports from the US, that is going to be dictated by Canada, Mexico, Europe, Asia, and so on. It's all about foreign income. The key point, therefore, exports are independent of the domestic business cycle. Perhaps it's something that in the heat of the exam, if you're just rushing through a question, you wouldn't think about. It's very easy for the examiner to throw a little bomb in there and say, oh, our economy is booming, therefore our exports will be up. No. Exports will be up if your overseas neighbours are actually booming, not us. That's key. Secondly, exchange rates. Imports and exports are influenced by your exchange rates. So your domestic currency appreciating means, so if we're here in the US, then it means the dollar is getting stronger. If the dollar is getting stronger, then it means imports are cheaper. We can buy more overseas goods with our dollars. Imports will therefore rise. Because they are now cheaper. Exports, however, become expensive for our trading partners. So for them to buy goods in dollars from us because the dollar has appreciated, their local currency has depreciated, it's more expensive for them to import from us, hence our exports will drop. And be efficient in your review, obviously. The line about domestic currency depreciating is obviously the exact opposite. So save paper, don't have reams of review notes written down where you're just writing the opposite thing down. So obviously if it depreciates, imports are now more expensive, exports are cheaper, and you get the opposite impact. So that's the external sector. Next up, some theories about the cycle. We looked at that diagram on the first slide of this reading and said, yep, we're looking for long-term growth, but inevitably you will see peaks and you will see troughs. Nobody since the dawn of trade has ever been able to stop the cycle. It's always there. So why does it happen? A couple of slides here, a few different theories. It can look quite intimidating, this table, to try and learn everything on it, but there's actually not that much to get into your head. So let's start with neoclassical. The neoclassical school, just think way back at the dawn of economics. Neoclassical school says the cause of business cycles, technology changes. So you get an advance in technology. Think back to a production function. What you actually produce in your economy is to a certain extent a function of your level of technology. So technology gets boosted, your productivity goes up, you get a boom. What should you do to try and counter that? How do you smooth the cycle? Well, according to the neoclassical school, nothing. You allow wages, prices to adjust. If you've studied macroeconomics, that should be fresh in your mind. You allow wages to adjust, which will bring us back to an equilibrium. In my head, for this first line, I would just have the standard macroeconomic diagram in my head. We start off at the equilibrium. For some reason, aggregate demand weakens. We come out here. But remember, that causes unemployment. So your short-run aggregate supply curve will move and get us back to where we need to be. So I just have that sat in my head as a reminder that the neoclassical schools say, allow wages, prices to adjust to bring us back to where we should be. In summary, neoclassical, it's technology, do nothing. Wages will sort it out. What about Keynes, the Keynesian school? Well, Keynesian school claims that the aggregate demand curve will shift due to changes in business expectations. So it's us. It's the demon thoughts in our head that are causing these cycles. And rather disturbingly, one of Keynes' most famous phrases ever, you will get stuck in a contraction because of sticky wages. So once again, if you go back to your classic macro diagram, Keynes, there's aggregate demand, there's your short-run aggregate supply. What Keynes is saying is that aggregate demand weakens, we're stuck in this contraction, and the short-run aggregate supply curve will not move because wages are sticky. So this exact mechanism that the neoclassical school thinks will get us back to equilibrium doesn't actually work. So what do you do? Again, I think it's fairly easy to remember if you stick to this diagram. The neoclassical schools say the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift and get us back to equilibrium, whereas Keynes says it won't. Well, there's only one other curve on there that can move, and it's aggregate demand. So if the short-run aggregate supply curve isn't going to move, Keynes says we need to make the aggregate demand curve move, kick it back up to where it should be. So, intervene. Doesn't care whether it's fiscal policy or monetary policy, but intervene to get us back to full employment. So remember, fiscal policy will be government spending, taxation. Monetary policy will be an increase in the rate of growth of the money supply. Either way, you're kick-starting aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So I think they're fairly straightforward if you remember our big macro diagram. Then we have New Keynesian, which, to be honest, is pretty much riding on the coattails of Keynes. It says, yep, we agree with Keynes. Okay, well, thanks for that. All they add in is everything is sticky. So Keynes restricted his stickiness to wages. New Keynesian says all input prices are sticky. So, whereas Keynes says that aggregate demand will stick down here, short-run aggregate supply won't move. New Keynesians say, well, exactly the same. So their policy is exactly the same. The only difference, Keynes, sticky wages, New Keynesian, sticky everything. So that's a kind of classic trade-off. I think they're fairly straightforward to remember. On the next slide, monetarists. What do monetarists say? Well, in this context at least, not much. The monetarist says the cause of the business cycle is an inappropriate change in the money supply growth rate. Recommended policies, therefore, don't make inappropriate changes in the money supply growth rate. Pretty straightforward. Just imagine a monetarist who's just got the job of controlling the money supply growth rate and wants an easy life. Well, if you want an easy life, say, look, if I do anything, it's going to cause a cycle, so let's not. So don't be inappropriate. Good piece of advice generally in your career. And instead, have a steady, predictable growth rate. Again, fairly easy to remember. Then the Austrians. The only mention in this entire syllabus of the Austrian school of thought. Here it is. Cause of business cycles, government intervention. Look at that. Let me just jump back for a moment. Look at Keynes. Keynes' exact recommended policy is to intervene. The Austrians say it's intervening that causes the problem in the first place. So don't. Remember, Keynes said one thing you could do, use monetary policy. If aggregate demand is weak, use monetary policy to try and kickstart aggregate demand. That will be expansionary monetary policy. Put more money into the economy. Putting more money into the economy is going to drop interest rates way down. If interest rates are low, people start to consume because the opportunity cost of consumption is low. And as people consume, that's the C in aggregate demand, it kickstarts. Austrians say don't. All you're doing is creating credit bubbles. It's ultimately going to lead to a big boom and then a huge crash. So don't intervene, do nothing. And you're seeing a kind of common theme develop here. Everybody apart from Keynes. Neoclassical. Technology causes the cycle. Sit back and allow wages to adjust. Monetarists, inappropriate money supply causes the problem. Sit back and be predictable. Austrians, don't intervene. Just sit back and let things happen. Pretty much everyone except Keynes and the New Keynesians say, don't intervene. And the final school, the New Classical, also known as real business cycle theory. It's kind of helpful, I think, to remember both, because otherwise it's easy to get confused between neoclassical and new classical. New classical, well, remember Keynes and the New Keynesians? Pretty much the New Keynesians riding on Keynes' coattails. Same thing here, neoclassical versus new classical. Just to refresh our memory, neoclassical, what causes the cycle? Technology. New classical, real business cycle theory, what causes the cycle? Technology and other external shocks. So it could be oil price doubling, something like that. It's a rational response to these two things. Their policy, think back to neoclassical, do nothing. So in a way, this table is fairly straightforward to learn. Everybody except Keynes and the New Keynesians are saying, don't really do anything. Other than that, remember the causes. Neo, well, neoclassical say it's technology, new classical technology, and other external shocks. Keynes, sticky wages, New Keynesians, sticky everything. Austrians, intervening. Monetarists, inappropriate money supply. So it's all fairly common themes. They're your business cycle theories. Next up, the impact, the result, if you like, of these business cycles. What does it do to unemployment and inflation? Well, first of all, unemployment. 3 definitions on this slide. It's one of those nice little areas of the syllabus, nice LOSs where you just need to be able to define these things. So these will be time savers in the exam if you're asked to define one of these. Frictional and structural, keep those separate from cyclical. At the top, frictional, that's the time it takes employers and employees to find each other. So it's a beautiful tale, really. You have the perfect job over here. You have the perfect candidate waiting to get that job. It just takes them time to find each other. Structural, well, that's all about the economy changing and gaining new skills. So structural unemployment, you have a coal mine or a steel mill that closes, and you have a data input center, a technology center that opens. So there are 5,000 people unemployed, 5,000 jobs that need filling. We just need to retrain these miners into technology. Those two, to a certain extent, will always be present. Even in conditions of full employment, you will still see frictional and structural. It's cyclical that disappears at full employment. That's unemployment from changes in growth. That's what we're seeing along the cycle. So once again, to refer to our classic macro diagram, aggregate demand weakens, GDP falls below full employment, that's when you'll get cyclical unemployment. So know the difference between the three, and crucially, which of them are present even at full employment, frictional and structural. How do we measure it? Well, unemployment rates, a couple of different ratios to look at. We need to define unemployed first of all. To be defined and counted as unemployed, you need to be available for work and actively looking. The labor force is all of those who are employed and those who we've just defined as unemployed, available and actively looking for work. Using those two figures, we can calculate the unemployment rate. The examiner pretty much wants you to describe that, but I don't think it's going to be too much of a reach just to give you some numbers and get you to work out an unemployment rate. It's pretty straightforward. Slightly more detail, the participation ratio, that's the labor force. So remember what the labor force is from the previous slide, over the working age population. And that's taken to be over 16 years old. Key point here, discouraged workers are not in the labor force. So they're available but not trying to get a job. They're not in the labor force and they're not counted as unemployed. So be careful. Okay, inflation, disinflation and deflation. The examiner obviously sees a good area to test here to make sure we've read the syllabus, dis versus deflation. I think most of us are probably happy with inflation, persistent increases in price levels over time. We can calculate the inflation rate, and we have a little bit of detail to do on that on the coming slides. So we can work out the percentage increase in price levels. But be careful, dis versus deflation. Disinflation, prices are still rising. So disinflation, prices are still rising. It is a decrease in a positive inflation rate over time. So maybe 1 year inflation was 3%. The next year inflation is 2%. Prices are still rising, but we're going through a period of disinflation. If prices are falling, that is deflation. So a persistent decrease in price, negative inflation is deflation. No two ways about that, really. Just make sure you learn the difference. Hyperinflation, out of control, high inflation. That's pretty much all you need to say. There's no strict definition that we need of what counts as out of control. So we have a little definition of employment and a couple of ways of calculating unemployment rates. We've defined inflation, so it makes sense to go on and see if we can measure inflation. And we can, using some sort of price index. The classic, some sort of retail or consumer price index. The idea is to get a weighted average of goods and services in one period and compare it to a base period. Very much like the GDP deflator when you're looking at nominal and real GDP. And that's used as a proxy for the overall or average price level. So the CPI looks at a fixed basket of goods and services. So it's meant to be some sort of typical household basket of goods and services and compare the cost of that basket today to the base period. Now, there are issues with that basket, issues with this method, and adjustments that we can make. So make sure you know the definition first, then we'll talk about all the twists. So here's the basic method. Find the cost of the basket of goods in a base period and find the cost today. Once you have that, here's the current, here's the base. That will give you a measure of inflation. So quite simply, if the basket has gone from $2,005 to $2,900, CPIs have gone from 100 up to 116. That's a 16% increase, 16% inflation. Simple as that. However, there are twists, there are biases, and there are things we need to do to try and take account of those biases. Other inflation indices, well, we've talked about the GDP deflator a moment ago, real to nominal. The GDP deflator is another way of getting inflation. You could also look at a price index for personal consumption expenditure. So rather than looking at a household basket of goods, we survey, I say we, I don't do it, but you would survey businesses instead of consumers. That's the key. Or you could look at rather than a consumer price index, you look at a producer price index, a PPI instead of the CPI. The argument here is that might give you a kind of heads up about forthcoming inflation. Any increase in the producer price index will eventually find its way through to consumers. So what we're doing here is looking at kind of raw materials, intermediate and finished goods prices in the producer sector. So things like metals, lumber, chemicals, and so on. Whether they are the raw materials, whether they're work in progress, or finished goods the producers are passing on. The idea, as I say, any increase in those kind of commodity type products will eventually fuel consumer inflation. So we have our basic measures, the CPI. We have some alternatives to mention to the examiner. And then we have the twists and the little kinks to try and iron out. First one, food and energy. So we can just look at a general inflation figure, a price index including everything. That's headline inflation. The problem, as analysts, what we always want to do is get a feel for some sort of trend, some sort of long-term, nice, smooth trend. And to try and get that, often an analyst will look at core inflation. Problem with headline, food and energy are in there. They are pretty volatile, so they've got short-term fluctuations. We'll try and get rid of that noise, that short-term noise, by removing food and energy and stating core inflation. That should give us a smoother long-term trend. So one problem, volatility, food and energy. Solution, get rid and instead quote core inflation. Other problems, three classics here on the next slide: substitution, new goods, and quality improvements. All three take inflation in the same direction, so it's easy to remember. All three overstate the true rate of inflation. So the three of them, first of all, substitution. If you see, for example, a huge increase in the price of coffee because there's a bad coffee harvest or the coffee growing areas are being gradually eroded, then people will switch away. They will substitute other products for those goods. So although it looks like inflation is raging because coffee prices are through the roof, people just stop buying coffee and switch to something else. So you can avoid it if you like. New goods replace older, lower priced products. So you look at your basket over time, new goods are coming in that are more expensive. So that will make it look like prices are rising. And thirdly, existing products that are in your basket may actually go up in price because of quality improvements. So over time, a classic example is cars. You look at cars, they get more expensive because they're of higher quality. They've got more gadgets in there, more safety, and so on. So these are three problems that we can try and deal with. And the great news, which I'm sure you'll be pleased about, is that we can try and adjust for them, and we need to tell the examiner how. So a couple of different methods to talk about. L'Espère and Parsh, and then we can look at the Fisher index, which is a geometric mean of the two. So first of all, just sit back and think about what we're doing with our basket of goods and how we're calculating inflation. We've said a couple of slides ago, let's look at our current basket of goods. What does it cost today? Let's look at our basket of goods in a base year price and get inflation. Now the problem is this, one of these problems is the nature of the basket is changing over time. So to get around that, we can start to try and use these two slightly different methods. The first one, we're going to calculate CPI by using the basket weights from the base period. So in a really ridiculously straightforward example to keep in your head, let's imagine in the base period there are only two goods in your basket. It's a fairly dull household, food, drink, soft drinks. So you've got food and soft drinks. Let's say in the base period, you're buying those 50-50. Today, you're buying 80 food and 20 drink. Well, under the first index here, L'Espère's index, what you're going to do is use the 50-50 from the base period today. Parsh goes the other direction and says, let's use the basket weights from the current period and see what those weightings would have cost in the base period. So once again, the base was 50-50. Today is 80-20. A Parsh index would say, right, 80-20, let's go back and see what that basket would have cost in the base period and calculate inflation that way. Fisher, best of both worlds. To try and reduce this substitution bias, to try and get around the fact that people are changing the basket, we will take a geometric mean, which we all know and love from basic quant, geometric mean of the two. All you really need to do is tell the examiner that they exist, and the idea is that they're trying to get around these different sources of bias. So we have our unemployment, we have our inflation, and we have some calculations that we can describe to the examiner. Next up, what causes inflation? Factors that affect price levels. You'll like this because effectively you've seen these diagrams before elsewhere in macro. Let's have a look. Cost push and demand pull inflation. So cost push, sometimes referred to as wage push inflation. Increases in wages, other inputs, so maybe commodities, decrease short-run aggregate supply. Well, as I say, if you know your classic macro diagram, you should be in business. Here's short-run aggregate supply. If it decreases, it shifts back there. You're pulling up price levels. Demand pull, it's not the short-run aggregate supply curve that's moving. It is the aggregate demand curve. So we'll see those two in action. First of all, cost push inflation, increase in wages, increase in commodity prices is going to reduce short-run aggregate supply. So we're saying SRAS goes down. Remember what that means? Less supply at every price level, hence the curve will shift back to the left and prices rise. Downside, well, this is stagflation. Prices are rising. That's the point of this LOS. We're looking at cost push inflation. But the real bad news, we also have an output gap and unemployment. So we have to choose as a government what we're going to deal with. Will we try and deal with inflation or will we try and deal with unemployment? Problem is, if we try and deal with unemployment, taking a kind of Keynesian approach by kickstarting aggregate demand, then we've made inflation worse. So it's your choice. But if you do intervene and kickstart aggregate demand, prices will rise again. Could be wages, could be any other resource that kickstarts. Secondly, demand pull, fairly self-explanatory. It's not supply curves moving, it's aggregate demand. An increase in aggregate demand, hence larger aggregate demand at every price level, it will shift out to the right. And there is your higher price. Where we go from there depends on your school of thinking and your reaction. In theory, at least, short-run aggregate supply curves should shift back as they feel the pinch of increased wage demands and prices go up again. Why did aggregate demand go up? Well, any number of reasons. Could be if the government's intervening, fiscal policy, or monetary policy. The government caused it, or could be business expectations, who knows. So there are two types, whether it's the demand side or the supply side causing it. Next up, linking the two. We've talked earlier on about the unemployment rate and how we can measure it. We've talked about looking at the cycle and the impact on GDP. Kind of tie the two together with the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. What is it? Well, keywords. It's the lowest unemployment rate that will not induce wage push inflation. Remember, that's another word for cost push. So back to a couple of slides ago, the short-run aggregate supply curve we said would cut back if resource prices, and one of those could be wages, start to rise. So it's like a supply shock. Wages go up, short-run aggregate supply curve shifts back to the left, and prices rise. Now, the lowest unemployment rate is the one that will not induce that wage push inflation, sometimes referred to as just the natural rate of unemployment. That's from Friedman. It's going to vary over time. It's going to vary country to country. And if you're looking at it and thinking, well, surely that's simply full employment or zero cyclical, not necessarily, because you may see this pressure in different economic segments. So as the technology sector rises, for example, there may be a chronic shortage of skilled people in that sector, which is going to force wages up in that sector, despite the fact that you've got no pressure in other sectors of the economy. So be careful, you can't necessarily equate the two. So that's quite nice. It kind of ties together where GDP is going, inflation and unemployment. And finally, leading, lagging, and coincidental indicators. This is one of those rare areas of the CFA syllabus where you just have a little bit of learn and churn to get through. I would approach it like this. With a couple of months to go to your exam, you are going to have a list of these kind of areas. This is one area that will be on that list. And little and often, every night for maybe 15 minutes, you are going to be testing yourself on these lists. In terms of an overview, you need a review sheet that has the three categories. So very quickly, leading, coincident, and lagging. So that's the first thing you look at, leading, coincident, lagging. To test yourself, you have a piece of paper with three headings on. If you want to get really excitable about this, have a little piece of paper with each of these indicators on and see how fast you can get each of them into the right column. Leading means turning points in these indicators precede business cycle peaks and troughs. So clearly, leading indicators are the most useful. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of them to learn. There they are. I can't add too much value by reading them out to you. But look, building permits ties back to earlier in this reading where we talked about housing being an important part of the cycle. So that ties in. It's quite nice. Expectations, obviously. Expectations are looking into the future, so you would expect that to be a leading indicator. The one you probably hear most chat about, and certainly back in 07, 08, retrospectively, you can look back and see that it was a leading indicator. What happens to your yield curve? Is it starting to flatten? People will say that's the best indicator that we might be heading into a trough. Apart from that, it's fairly straightforward stuff. Coincident indicators, they turn along with the cycle. So you'll see it going along with GDP. Certainly over in the US, non-farm payroll is a huge figure, first Friday of every month. Bloomberg goes into an excited frenzy about the announcement of non-farm payroll, but It is just a coincident indicator, so not that good at predicting the future. And we have production, manufacturing, personal income less transfer. Fair enough. And finally, lagging, so they follow the cycle, so not that much use. Look at this one. Unemployment tends to lag. We talked earlier on about businesses being slow to react, slow to hire and fire. Hence, it makes sense. If they're slow to react, that the unemployment rate is going to lag behind what's actually happening in the cycle. We also mentioned the inventory sales ratio. Once again, we said firms were slow to react to what's happening, so it makes sense that those two we talked about are going to be lagging indicators. After that, once again, really just learn the list and make sure you can say whether they are leading, coincident, or lagging. Kind of like this reading. Overall, it ties together nicely. You have a big table of all the different theories. You then have to talk about unemployment, GDP, inflation, and tie them all together at the end and then see how we can try and predict where this cycle is going.